Thanks. It's very nice to be back. Thanks, Goddard, for the introduction. We don't do a lot of lectures in this format, so we are going to try some stuff out. It's going to be a little bit of an experiment. We're going to talk about our own work and explain some of what we do, but we are going to try and think the whole thing through publishing, which we haven't done so much before, so kind of trying to follow the line of publishing through various different outputs that we have and use that as a kind of editing principle to figure out what it is that we're going to talk about here with you tonight. And then we also wanted to use the talk as a publishing space in itself. We think of publishing as any form of making public. So we're also going to just read some more or less unedited chunks of a novel that we're writing together. And we're going to kind of interrupt the lecture with these chunks of novel. It's probably going to be quite awkward at first, but hopefully it'll sort of start to stabilize somewhere around the middle.
It's called a road movie, is the name of the novel we're writing.
Yeah. And the other thing is that we don't have a slideshow. So we have embedded all of the images and the video and text material that we're going to look at today. It's embedded in this zip file publication called Yes, which we made a few years ago, and we've kind of like hollowed part of it out in order to insert this material into it. We have also some like booklets to hand around while we talk. So in case you get bored.
Yes. What are you looking for?
Quick time.
Quick time. Sorry, we have a small technical moment. Sorry, all my folders.
Oh no. Yeah,
Window.
Time.
New screen record.
Screen.
New screen recording. Like this.
Yes.
Good. I hope it's okay. I'm gonna do some. Well, we'll see.
Yep.
Very good. Okay, so yes, we are Slow Reading Club. I'm just going to introduce the basic premise of the practice, or how we started, and then we'll get more into the talk around publishing. So, Slow Reading Club formed, like you said, in 2017 or so, and it started with the idea that, we wanted to make a reading group that was more interested in how we read as opposed to what we read. So both of us come from backgrounds where we have to read a lot as part of the research process and things like this. So we thought to kind of leave that to the side for a moment and actually interrogate this question of how we read as part of the meaning-making process. And we said at that moment, if reading is something that you perform, which we would argue you do perform it, then it could also be choreographed, and that perhaps it already is choreographed. So certain things like reading while sitting, or reading while laying down, or while sitting in a train, or while being in a cafe, all kind of affect how meaning is being had between the text and the reading body. And Slow Reading Club aims to kind of look particularly at the situation of reading and add choreographies that might enhance, amplify, or interrupt naturalized patterns of reading. It's going to become a bit clearer later on.
So given that we wanted to talk about publication, we thought we would begin with the first output of Slow Reading Club, which is a PDF document. So, yeah, we had this joke for a long time. It was kind of a joke. It was kind of a proposition that we had this reading club that would be interested in how one reads, but we never met once to try this out. We never did it. We just kind of talked about it. And once we were together in a bar, we were drinking, we had our laptops with us, and we somehow decided it was a nice moment to write a manifesto for what this reading club might be. We thought the manifesto was a kind of an interesting form to get into at that moment, timely. And so we kind of, we produced this document a little bit sort of drunkenly. I'm just going to read just the very first entrance, which is, Slow Reading Club begins with an attack on the assumption that there is a single, correct, and upright, erect posture from which reading is performed. It means to reconceive the erect spine and move towards other means of understanding, positioning, and spatializing the erection of the reader. So the whole thing is kind of filled with these slightly off sex jokes. We were thinking about erotics a lot at the time. Like, both Brianna and I come out of a training, as I suspect everyone else here does, which is that we've been trained quite well to do things like critical reading, to search for authorial intention, to deconstruct a text, kind of basically ways of demonstrating dominance over a text or kind of adopting a distance to a text. And with Slow Reading Club, we wanted to think about like what would be a way to be rather close to a text and to also let a text sort of dominate us. And thinking through erotics was a way of thinking about like an exceptional state in which it's possible to flip between dominant, submissive, self, other, subject, object, inside, outside. The idea is that all of these things are kind of up in the air for a moment. And I think we were also particularly interested in one definition of erotics that comes from a writer called Deborah Berghoffen. And Deborah says that erotics is an ethics of protecting the other's strangeness. And so this idea of how to be with something, with someone, without trying to sort of like uncomplicate its strangeness was for us a way of being with text as well.
So after we kind of passed around this PDF, we were at one moment invited by somebody to do an iteration of Slow Reading Club, which essentially was a project that had not been made yet. So this PDF actually is the kind of, maybe initial fiction from which the project came out. So in response, we had to make a project for Slow Reading Club the year after. Just gonna...
Several months after even. It was kind of a very quick process.
Yeah.
The person who invited us didn't realize that it was not an existing project and we didn't correct them.
So at the time, it's maybe, we thought it would be good to just introduce slightly the two different practices that we were coming from at the moment, because it also informed a lot of the politics and the practice of slow reading. So I studied dance and choreography at Parts in Brussels, and at that time, a lot of myself and also the people in my class were thinking a lot around expanded choreography. So basically trying to apply choreographic principles to things that were other than dance or movement, reading, for example, or social choreography or things like this. And at the time, I was working a lot on a piece called Indispensable Blue Offline, which was essentially a choreography that I perform half live, half in screen recording on my desktop.
And I have a music training, so I come out of a background in experimental music composition. I studied in Perth in Australia, and then I moved to Germany at a point. And in Germany, in Berlin particularly, the scene that I was involved in was it has a lot of analogs to like structuralist film. So we were all kind of very busy with thinking about the relationship between a sound and the listener, and trying to kind of set up specific situations in which sound and listening would meet, say. So it was kind of always thinking first from the point of view of reception and less from the point of view of production, which I think is something that really carries into what we do with Slow Reading Club. At the time we started working together, I was in KASK, and I was making a piece which was called Stanzas, or the Law of the Good Neighbor, which is essentially a very long list of words, and I would kind of organize these private or semi-public or public readings with friends. So it's not the first thing that we made, but at some point fairly early in the period of working together, we were kind of thinking about this idea of signature pieces. So this is a term I always really like one signature piece. No? And so Brianna's signature piece at the time was very much Indispensable Blue. My signature piece was very much stanzas. These were the pieces that everyone would kind of think about when they thought about us as individual makers. And then we were thinking about countersigning. So whenever you have any kind of formal document, like a formal agreement, like a contract, you need two signatures, and this is called countersigning. So we decided to make a piece which was called Signatures, which was more or less just the two pieces at the same time. But we were kind of finding ways to sort of mash them up a little bit. So certain text from Brianna's video would kind of seep into the audio and vice versa. We have no recordings of that piece, but we're going to kind of make a little bit of an analog now by just playing two files at once.
Yes.
So this is also a little bit of an experiment.
Let's see. We're missing some sound. Okay, let's try that all again.
Is it in there?
Let's see. Can do a little test right now.
Yeah, sounds.
Yes.
Matt,
That's weird.
foreign,
All right, we're ready. Okay.
human, Hammond, Harmon, Mormon, Mordant, Formant, Format, Foreign, Villain, Village, Fillet, Valid, Valet, Relay, Relate, Related, Rated, Rooted, Written, Rotten, Hothouse, Bauhaus, How Now, Countdown, Sound Off, Sort of, Sawn Off, Sauna, Sorbet, Foray, Foreplay, Forte, Quartet, Corvette, Covet, Covenant, Confident, Confidant, Conference, Governance, Vonnegut, Virgin, Furnace, Faucet, Figure, Fisher, Pressure, Present, Pregnant, Prussian, Prescient, President, Presbyterian, Aquarian, Aquarium, Aquinas, Finders, Find Us, Fitness, Finesse,
Moving light.
Finish,
Acrozessa holo sleep
Vanish,
body. Moving G.
Village,
Into a hiat that is
Philistine,
not deceiving th
Palestine,
slumber inclination
Forage,
of the bedro om
Follicle,
into a hd that is not
Political,
gaining the slumber
Umbilical,
backching the sh
Unbearable,
into a head th that is
Medical,
not designing the
Remedial,
pieth was it talks on the hot
Fremantle,
outlet face into a
Freelancer,
he ad that is not designing
Freeloader,
the dripping of
Free
half
market,
Hawaii thoughts into a
Fricandel,
he ad that is not
Frida Kahlo,
fucking the pillow
Freeze,
into a h head that is
France, Finance, Violence, Fiancé, Beyonce, Bouncy,
fucking the pilo
Bouncy,
into a he ad that slips into a head laying gin lie in the bed into a position that low ox mortar lay stead into low v or half light swooning into the mattress.
subtle,
G fabric.
circle,
Swooning into the
certain,
Weege bet ween duvet sheet.
surname,
Swooning into
survey,
spitting it out.
sir, fur, for, full, fume, fumes, food, Führer, bureaucrat, Bermuda, Bemoan, Ramones, romantic, Germanic, demonic, demolish, polish, Polish, foolish, furnished, furrow, furrow, thorough, thoroughfare, thorax, Halifax, elephants, elevate, elegant, immigrant.
What you could call my life on the road began not long before my wife and I operated before Dean Moriarty. Always that dreaming of going west to see the country, never going. Dean is the perfect guy for the road planning, never going. He was actually born on the road when his parents were on their way to Lost Passing to Salt Lake City. Angles came first reports from him. Chad showed me letters from Dean written in a Mexico jail for kids. This was all far back when Dean was a mysterious jail kid the way he is today. Out of jail coming news to New York. There was talk that he had York for the first time. He married a girl called Mary Lou. Married a girl called Mary Lou. All the time Dean was telling Mary Lou things like, Mary Lou. All the time Dean was telling things like, although I haven't quite, darling, although I haven't told you everything I was thinking, it is absolutely necessary now to postpone the Mississippi River, to being those things concerning our personal love. He talked in thinking about work-life plans. That was how he talked in those early days, I went to their little apartment with the boys, and Dean came to the door in his shorts. Dean had blue eyes and a reel to the door in his shorts. He had walked on an Oklahoma accent, on a farm, long before he had married Mary Lou. She was a blonde with curly hair, she said, smoky eyes on the couch. Although she was a sweet little girl, she was stupid and could do horrible things, horrible things.
That night, we drank beer and talked until dawn, and in that night, in the morning, in the grey light of a morning, in a gloomy day, Dean got up nervously and walked around thinking gloomy day. Then he decided Mary Lou could get some breakfast. Later, I went away. During the net week, he told Chad King that he was absolutely during the next week that I was a writer and I had to learn to write. I should come to me for advice. Dean had a fight with Mary Lou in the Hoboken apartment, and she was so angry that she went to the river from New York. Dean policed some false crazy thing so that Dean had to run away from Hoboken, had to run. He come out to Paterson, New Jersey, and one night when I was studying, there was a knock on the door, and there was Dean in the dark hall saying, "Hello, you remember me, Dean Moriarty, to show me how to write." And he said, "Yes, of course, I know exactly what you mean." And in fact, all those problems have come to my attention, and things I didn't understand. We understood each other on different levels of madness, and we agreed that he could stay at my house, and we would go out west at some time. That was the winter of 1947.
But all the cray things that were going to happen began then. All the crazy things would mix up all of my friends and all I had left of my family. Carlo told Dean of a big dust cloud over the American night. Lee in Texas growing marijuana. Jane wandering on Times Square full of marijuana. Wandering on Times Square until someone took her to drugs. And Dean told people in West Bellevue Hospital, like Big Ed Dunkel, the car player, girlfriends, sex parties, and other adventures. Girlfriends, sex parts, and other adventures. Then the spring came, the great time of traveling. And then the spring came, the great time of traveling. I was everybody. I was busy working on my novel. And when I was halfway, I got tripped down south. Got ready to travel west for the very first time. To travel west for the very first time.
Dean left before me. Carlo and I went with him to the 34th Street bus station. Dean was wearing a real Western bus station. He business suit and he blew for $11. He also bought it in a store for $11. He also had a small typewriter and said he was going to start writing. We had a last meal as soon as he got a job and a room, and Dean got on a bus and said Chicago and off into the night. I promised myself to go the same way soon. I promised myself to go the same way soon. And this was really the way that my whole road experience began. And things that happened must be began and were amazing and must be told. Why you could call my life on the road began not long life on the road, began not long wife and I operated that dreaming of going west before Dean Moriarty, to see the country, never Dean is the perfect guy, never could, never going. He was actually born to Lost Passing, to Salt Lake City, when his parents were on the road. Angles came first reports, Chad lost angels, came first letters from Dean in a Mexico jail for kids. This was all far back, jail kids back when Dean was a mysterious news to New York, that he had York for the first time. He married a girl called Mary Lou. Marry a girl called Mary Lou.
So after we were invited to make a slow reading club, essentially, we came up with a format which is a sort of, large-scale collective reading session. So I'm just going to pull up some images quickly now. So this is actually an image of one of the first reading club sessions. What we would do is we make a booklet of about, I think some of them are being passed around now. It's around 10 or so excerpts of text. And for each text, we propose a certain protocol that will kind of choreograph us and the public in terms of how it's going to be read.
So I think what's also important is they're not texts that we write. They're texts that we find. They're all existing texts. We're only working on the apparatus of reading.
Yes. And part of also for us the apparatus of reading includes things like the time of the performance. So usually we try to do the reading sessions very late at night. So when you're in this kind of fatigued state or you're ready to go out clubbing, one of the two. So usually around 11 o'clock at night and going till around 2 in the morning. So it also works a lot with the exhaustion as well in the late night. Also, we try to kind of create an architecture within an architecture where the reading is performed. So usually we lay out a bunch of carpets, so there's this massive carpeted space, and then we use theater lights that are gelled yellow to kind of shift the space in this yellowish hue. They also have an app on your computer where you can kind of change the screen to be a bit more yellow to ease the eyes into reading at night. So thinking along things like this. We also serve, and you can see maybe little bottles, but we also serve little bottles of alcohol. Usually it's rum, and pre-COVID times we would pass it around and people could take small swigs and then pass it to the next person. So even like how intoxication can be a participant in reading.
This is an example of one of the protocols. So we call this one white noise. Basically, there's two positions. You're in partners. One person's reading and one person's listening. And the person who's reading is lying down and they're speaking out loud the text. And the person who is listening is basically touching the neck of the reader and trying to sort of like read through the vibrations of the vocal cords What you don't see in this picture is there's quite loud white noise being played into the space, so it blocks all of the airborne frequencies of people speaking, but it also creates a very sort of thick, strange atmosphere to be in. The other thing with these theatre lights is we don't use LED lights, we use halogen bulbs, so they get extremely hot because they're on kind of quite low things. So it's a kind of sweaty, sticky, yellowy situation somehow.
There's also a small tea that we serve before the performances. It's a tea that you have to take it in your mouth, and you have a whole mouthful, and you hold it there for 1 minute, and then afterwards you swallow it, and it kind of numbs a little bit the mouth. It's called kava kava. It's not necessarily legal everywhere, but so we serve this as an option before the performance begins, or the reading begins. That's us hosting a reading session. Here is it's a protocol called strobe. So the idea is that we read with a strobe light as the only source of light. And we do it for, it's a timed amount, it's 6 minutes, because it's quite intensive and quite nauseating. That's another protocol. Here's also a session that we did in, I think it was Los Angeles. And it was kind of nice because we were in this, we were in the Schindler house, and there's this huge medicinal garden outside. And we invited somebody to make a tea from all of the herbs within the garden that was then served during the session as well. So we often try to have these kind of, tight binds as well to the different places that we're working.
This is the white noise again, but it's with black light. Black light, white noise. We were doing a show in a project space in Oslo that had a huge window to like a mirrored window to the street, basically. So passers-by would see a mirror, but you could see out. And it was summer in Oslo, and sunlight is important, I think, in Norwegian culture because there's so little of it. And so we basically, rather than using the yellow lights for this session, we replaced all of the bulbs in the space, because it was a domestic space, with black lights. And then we just had them on, and basically we bridged the sunset. So at a certain point, the natural light died down, and then this kind of black light effect comes in. And when you read with a black light on white page with black text, basically the white page shines and the black text doesn't. So it's a way of reversing a kind of foreground-background relationship, and it's maybe a bit more like a screen or something.
That's the end of that. Just thinking of some other protocols that maybe we can say off the top of our head as well. There's protocols using skin contact and kind of like whispering back and forth the text to each other. There are some other ones that deal specifically with the graphic layout and how to read, taking into account the layout of the text, and other such.
We wanted to also quickly mention, so we have these 3 principles of working. So when we started collaborating, it was useful that we had this PDF of the manifesto, because it was a kind of template to think into, and whenever we would disagree about something, we could kind of go back to the manifesto. But we also, when we started working together, we wanted to set out 3 different principles of working. So these were just kind of rules that we would hold ourselves to as a way of kind of managing the collaboration and encouraging us to make decisions that are a little bit different than the decisions we would make in our own practices. So they are these. Good neighboring is the first one. So good neighboring is a kind of, in every context that we try to locate who we think our neighbors might be and find ways to be useful to them and that they can be useful to us. So a very basic example would be, we were part of a conference in a place called La Loge, which was about architecture. was mostly architecture theorists speaking during the day. So we emailed all of them before and we said, what are you reading at the moment? What do you think we should read? And kind of trying to use the space of Slow Reading Club as a kind of digestion space for the material. The other thing about neighboring is that both Brianna and I, we don't want to think of it as a purely generous gesture also. We're both children of the suburbs, so we understand the neighbor to be quite a creepy figure, and so there's a sense in which the relationship is also about sort of leaching content out of whatever setting that we're in. So it's in one sense generous and in one sense kind of a taking, and it's a way of encouraging us to make decisions to read things that we wouldn't necessarily read otherwise. The second one is called Practicing Fearlessness. We have the feeling that with the kind of work that we make, it's not super interesting if we're really like on top of it and super confident in the way that we're sort of presenting it. So we were trying to find ways to like wrong foot ourselves. So we have this practice called Practicing Fearlessness, which would be, for example, right before we would do a talk, maybe Brianna will say, Henry, you're going to read that part and I'm going to read this part, and so you're not really ready. And there's this kind of way of like pushing ourselves onto the back foot and forcing ourselves to kind of improvise a little bit.
And then the final principle is choose everything, which is also for us a way of like thinking decision making. So both of us, maybe you've seen, have quite minimal tendencies within our work, and choose everything for us is a kind of maximalist principle to go against maybe certain tendencies. And it's also a way, if we're having a dispute in terms of which direction to go on something, to choose both presents ourselves a new problem, and we find it more interesting than maybe compromise or things like this. So, I mean, in some way, this talk also is a little bit of a choose everything moment of like, do we do a reading? Do we do a lecture? Okay, we choose both and try. We are not in the Dakotas, we are not in. Are we not in the Dakotas? Are we not in the Dakotas? Are we not in the show? We are not in the show. Blue with blue blossoms, and they, the blue flax blossoms, and now sweep the heat and dominate the hiss. And now dominate the sweep, and now dominate the sweep, and now sweep. We can so dominate the small, so small. The beginning to the lid is open. The land is to see them. The land is beginning to see them. Now dominate, now sweep, and now, the sweep except harm. Sweep except farmhouses seem so small, so small. Open up the beginning till the last is open. Hardly see the land as beginning to hope. Hardly the land as see them. The land is them. The land is begging to see them open up beginning to open up. Dayfully understand, hazily understand, on the horizon now. A horizon onto horizon, a horizon. I argue that physical discomfort is important only when the mood is wrong. I flatten as none of us feeling. Hour infester hour and can boredom can. Memories extreme of car trips are always of extreme flatness and great emptiness as far as you can see. I have none of us feeling, none of us fully understand feeling. I have a feeling that none of us fully understand 4 days in these car trips are always a flatness and great days and memories of car trips. A change in the road without a horizon, emptiness onto it as far as you can see. As far as you can see monotony, and monotony and boredom, as emptiness, as far as emptiness days.
So when we would do these reading sessions, we have to make these readers. So it kind of emerged initially totally practically, like if everyone's going to be reading text together, they need to have the text printed out. But at a certain point, we started to realize that this was itself a kind of a publishing gesture. We were making these little zines that we've been passing around. Typically, they're just copy shop zines, black and white printed. One of them, this one from Bata, this was designed by a proper designer, but everything else we do. And so, we started to realize that there was a kind of a readership that was emerging out of these readers. So it's always important for us that people can take them home after the session, and that none of the protocols that we do damage the text in any way. You can always read it at home if you would like, in whatever manner you like. And then they started to kind of behave in this hand-to-hand economy where friends would pass them on to other friends. And this started to be interesting, particularly with one poem. There's a poem that we've used a lot called Si Muero en la Carretera, which is a poem by Virgilio Piñero, who's a Cuban poet that we really like a lot. And as far as we're aware, we have the only English translation of this poem. So there's a whole readership of this poem in English that is basically people that have come to reading sessions of us and passed it on. It's appeared now in different academic texts and stuff, all via these reading sessions. For a long time, we were working with a translation that a friend of ours made. It's a little bit of a dodgy translation. She's not a native English speaker, but we like, nonetheless, the translation. But this, what Brianna's showing now, is from we were invited by an institution in Paris to make a performance a couple of years ago, and we had the opportunity to print a booklet as part of that. So we decided to use that opportunity to make a better English translation and also to translate the text into French. It's also the only French translation of that poem. And we did that translation collectively. We sat with some friends and did it all together. And that was quite a nice process. Neither Brianna or I speak Spanish, but you can quite quickly learn enough Spanish to translate this poem, and then it just became this very long process of discussing what the syntax should be when it's translated into English, what when it's in French, etc.
Also, an important aspect of these readers, because one question is how are we making these readers? Each time we do a reading session, we make an entirely new reader, which means essentially a lot of work each time. But it's also part of the kind of, thinking process for us. Each occasion of a reading session is a chance to kind of expand our readership and also to bring in text that we normally wouldn't read on our own. I'm just going to pull up also a link right now. I hope it's going to work. Perhaps some of you are already quite familiar with ARC. It works. So we're working a lot with shadow libraries, various ones that you can find, like PDF archives on the internet. A lot of the practice is about searching for PDFs, downloading PDFs, trading PDFs between our two hard drives, not reading PDFs also. So we're sort of part of the Slow Reading Club is kind of aggregating these masses of PDFs on our hard drives and sifting through them when we're making these reading sessions. Websites such as ARG have a particular politics of making information accessible, making text accessible. And it's also something that we kind of, also follow a lot in when making the readers. For us, it's important that they're free. We don't have the rights also to publish any of the text that we're publishing. So it's also a lot thanks to generosity of shadow libraries.
So we did a few, we've been doing these reading sessions for a while, and at a certain point we had this opportunity to make some work for exhibitions. So we got invited to make a solo exhibition at a gallery in Brussels, which is called Damien and the Love Guru. And so we made an exhibition which was called Soft Cover, Part of the thinking of that show was like trying to think about what's the exhibition as a publication space. As soon as you put something in an exhibition, you have a really different relationship to reading. Like, the public is not all together like they are in a performance. They don't want to read a lot of text. And there's also this kind of appreciation or kind of like knowledge of a sort of very material element of reading. So maybe we can show, like, this is one poem or one piece that we made for that. These are small booklets of poems that we made, which are collaged together. So we found a lot of material online on different forums and legal documents having to do with cell phone jammers. And we kind of cut them together, and we were interested in like jamming and noise as a kind of strategy. And so we kind of cut these poems together into little, or cut these forum texts together into little poems. And we laid them out as we would do a reader on a booklet, but we printed them on the outsides of these clear document wallets. And so the inside is filled with glue. This is construction wood glue that's been dyed with food coloring. And so as you can see, it kind of makes this like noisy material backing to the text, which makes it both in some sense harder to read, but in another sense, it also makes it possible to read, because otherwise there's text on both sides of the page, right? So if there was nothing in between, if there wasn't an opaque substance in between, the text would interfere with itself. What I kind of also like about these pieces is they stop the book from closing. They're too thick now. You can't close those books.
Another work is called Lapdog Jet Lag Bone Marrow. And for this work, I mean, at one moment we were interested in trying to figure out how we could also make the surface for writing. And weaving became, or this kind of very rudimentary form of weaving became interesting. So it's just two satin ribbons kind of bound together in the most basic weave you can do, and essentially creating ourselves a kind of page or space for writing. We were working at the time with a medieval medical manual, and working around Middle English. It's a moment before spellings were standardized, which is quite nice because you're reading a sentence and you can have the same word spelled 3 different ways within the same sentence. And so in order to understand the word, you sort of have to chew it, pronounce it, and have the feedback and hear it, and then you kind of can understand what the word is. So this kind of very, the physicality of reading within Middle English was interesting to us. And it also introduced, alongside with the weave, this relationship of thinking, writing, or thinking, working with text on the level of the letter and not on the level of the word. So because of the format here, we were working a lot with writing on Excel documents, because you could actually have this kind of gridded form, and we would separate the letters and kind of compose the text in that way.
It has also to do with the way that they're printed. So this is printed with Letraset, which some of you probably know. It's like kind of these scratch-on letters. What was interesting for us in terms of Letraset was that it's fairly labor-intensive. Like, it doesn't take ages to do one letter, but the time to do an entire text like this is quite long. And so it kind of introduced an element of economy into our writing. We're very used to writing digitally, in which you can just keep writing. And here you have to, every letter you have to decide, like, do I really want to invest that extra 2 minutes of putting per letter? Also because Letraset's a little bit difficult to find now. We have only a limited stock, and basically you get these pages that are like 20 letter A's, 20 letter B's, 20 letter C's. And so every time you print a letter, you use it up. And because we had limited stock, we would kind of force us into misspellings and kind of certain editing choices.
Mm. I mean, also there's certain things that are more for us, but like there's this big sweep of A's, which is actually super luxurious for, because you can't, you have to use 3 pages of Letraset because you're using all the A's. So certain things also have this kind of, luxurious or constrained quality with using this particular way of printing.
This is the last work from this exhibition that we wanted to show, but we were kind of thinking about bibliography. In academic writing, you have always this convention that, like, writing is always writing alongside a conversation. So there's ways of saying where certain ideas that you're saying, where they come from. And there's very, very clear conventions for how to make that obvious, and it's part of your responsibility as an academic. And we were thinking, like, artists also are part of a conversation that includes many people, not only themselves. But we don't have any system of convention in order to sort of point back at where ideas are coming from, or there's no shared conventions, say. So this is a kind of a bibliography where we took a weave that we'd made for a previous exhibition, and we inserted pictures of the authors that we were reading at the time and that were informing the kind of thinking of the show. So this is like Kathy Acker, Monique Wittig. What's also important with these is that nothing's fixed, like nothing's glued, nothing's stitched, they're all movable. And the idea is that each time that work gets installed, a new set of authors can be put in, and it can kind of be a bibliography for the thinking of that particular show.
Another aspect of the exhibition, so as much as we were also citing and trying to make obvious the different writers that have influenced us, we found it important to as well cite the friends that we were in sort of ongoing dialogue with at the moment and whose work was informing our work as well. So it was a solo exhibition, but we ended up inviting 2 other friends to show work within the framework as well. Let's see. So this is a work from Eleanor Ivory Webber, who, I mean, this is on the first day, so it's not very, it's not there yet, but so the proposal was that each day the gallerist would pass by the local newspaper shop and would pick up a copy of the day's New York Times and add it to the stack. So over the course of the exhibition, newspapers were being added each day, and by the end there was this kind of large stack. By accident, this is also at the time, so we had our opening in January 2020. So it actually, all of these New York Times track from this moment of basically there's the wildfires in Australia to the emergence of COVID in China and then as well within Italy. So it kind of spans this whole time period and becomes an interesting document of these month and a half or so.
And this is a piece by Gregory Poloni, a sculptor. And he wanted to we asked him to make a curtain, which would be the kind of outermost limit of the exhibition, so the extreme, the first thing you would encounter or the last thing you would pass as you left. And it's made from a special kind of fabric that gets used in theatre that's produced in Belgium from a company called Showtex. I don't remember exactly where they're based. But the way that it's sort of weighed down is with these age coins. So these are these little coins that you can use in, I think it's also something really Belgian, but you can use it to buy cigarettes with, and you're supposed to not be able to get it unless you're old enough to buy cigarettes. And so they weren't fixed in the base of this, and so like as people would touch the curtain, which they did because it was right in front of the door, they'd kind of move around and they bunched up, and over the course of the exhibition they started sort of like sagging and pulling on the curtain, and so there's kind of this sense of age as a distortive force.
I mean, something that we really appreciated that both of these works brought in was the sense of duration and eventliness to the exhibition. So.
Why you could call my life on the road began my life. Not long began, on the road began, not long wife. I operated that dreaming. Not long life, and I operated that dream, going west to Dean Moriarty, he to see the country, never dead, never could, never going. Dean was a mysterious news to New York. He had torn for the first time. Dean was a Mexico jail for kids. He married a girl's Mary Lou, girl called Mary Lou, marry a girl called Mary Lou. Chad and Tim Gray told me one day in college, Chad and Tim Gray told me one day in staying in rooms in East Harlem with beautiful time. Gray and staying in rooms, he had arrived the day before Mary Lou. On the corner, staying in rooms, arrived the day before Mary Lou about bug cream leaks. Bought beautiful cream, about bug cream leaks, bought beautiful big cream cakes, bought beautiful big cream cakes, bought beautiful big cream cakes.
Dean had a fight with Mary Lou, and she was advised in their hobo apartment. She went to the river from New York, some also not angry. Dean police had to run. He come that crazy thing. Dean, crazy Dean. That Dean had to run. He came out to Paterson, New Jersey, and one night, studying, there was a knock on the door. And there was Dean saying, hello. You knock on the door. And there was Dean saying, the dark hall. You remember me. To say Dean Moriarty. To say in the dark hall, remember me to show me how to write. Remember me to show me how to write me. To show me how to write. In the bar, I told Dean, you told Dean, you didn't come to me. You didn't come to me only in the bar. I told you. Didn't to me in that bar. What do I bar? In the bar, only to learn to be a writer. What do I really know about it? You have to work a waiter, except you really know about it. To be a writer, you have to work and work at it. To word and work at it. Have to work and work at it. Word and word at it. All, and he said yes, although problems have come. Problems have come to my attention. And those problems. And my attention. And those problems. And those problems come to my attention. I didn't understand on different levels, and I, and we agreed. We madness, and I, and we agreed that we could stay in my house. And I, and we agreed that he could. We would go out west sometime. That was the winter agreed. That was the winter of 1947. That was the Wood Girls of winter of 1947, or 1947. That was the Wood Girl of winter of 1947.
Then the spring came. The great time of traveling, the spring then came. Then the spring then came the great time of traveling. I was the great time of traveling, and then the spring came. I was everybody. I was busy working on my novel, The Great Time for Traveling. I was everybody. I was busy. Halfway trip down south, got read halfway. I was busy, got ready, tripped down south, getting ready to travel west for the very first time. The very first time down south, for the very first time to travel wet for the very first time. Then the spring came. The great time for traveling, the string then came the great time of spring, then the spring, the string then came the great time. Of I was the great time of spring came, I was everybody. I was the great time of traveling. And then the everybody was busy working on my novel. I was everybody. I busy working on my novel. The great time of busy, halfway trip down south, got read busy, halfway down south, got read halfway, got ready, trip, travel west for the very first trip down south for the very first time, down south for the very first time, to travel wet for time, for the very first time, to travel wet for the very first time. Then the spring came, the great time of traveling. The strong then came the spring came the great time of traveling. The spring then came the spring, the great time of traveling. The spring came the then the string, the great time of traveling. The spring, the great time of spring, the great time of traveling. The I tracing the great time of spring, of great time of traveling. The I became the I. Time off traveling, I was everybody. I was the great time of traveling, I was everybody, I was the great time of traveling, I was traveling, everybody was busy working, traveling, everybody was working on my novel, was craving, was working on my cover, the great on my novel, the great time of busy, halfway tripped, everybody the great time of busy got read halfway, tripped great time, read halfway, read down south, got busy, read ready, halfway, got read down south, got busy halfway, read trip down south for the very first trip down south, Tripped first time, the very south, for the trickle down south, for the very first time to travel we, for time, trickle time to travel wet. Yeah, so we've been reading these sections of this road movie, this road novel. So, yeah, what is that? Basically, at a certain point, we decided to try to write a novel. And we were thinking about genre, and we were thinking about how to write from the position of the reader. So, yeah, we wanted to kind of always start from reception and then come from production, rather than to kind of go the other way around. So we read, the most famous road novel is On the Road, which is by Jack Kerouac. I'm sure some of you read it. And there's this kind of legend of this, which is that he taped a lot of sheets of paper together and he put them in his typewriter so he wouldn't need to change paper. And he sat and he typed for 11 days and out came this novel. And I think for us, we thought of this as a kind of like digital logic, that if there's no page break, it feels more like typing into text edit. It's also somehow like the vertical scroll of Facebook or Instagram, like there's a kind of something very digital in it. And we came across an anecdote which we liked, which was Truman Capote, apparently not a fan of Jack Kerouac, said of this novel, yeah, okay, maybe it was written 11 days, but that's not writing, that's typing. And we thought, great, like, can we make writing more like typing? And in that way, can we maybe get closer at something like a kind of production through reception? So we've been collecting road novels and reading them and tracking where they go. So this is what we have so far. It's a mix of kind of pulp road novels and classics. And yeah, we've been kind of tracking these journeys across America that the books take. And the idea is to kind of stitch together a plausible journey from East Coast to West Coast. So you could start in New York with Jack Kerouac and you could ride that to like Chicago, and from Chicago you could jump on the electric Kool-Aid acid test. So kind of like using that as a way to constrain our reading. And then the process of writing is we read back and forth to each other. So, for example, Brianna will read the first chapter of On the Road, but she doubles every line based on the page, where it breaks on the page. So there's this kind of inbuilt repetition, and while she's reading that, I try as much as I can to type everything. There's a very different pace of typing than writing, and so a lot of stuff gets lost, but also things like autocorrect become really important, because certain words, they start shifting in the autocorrect. And that becomes what we call the first generation, and then I read back the first generation and double it, and Brianna tries to transcribe it, that's the second generation, and so forth. So every generation, it's kind of, the typing is more and more overcoming the writing. So what you heard, or what we've been kind of doing throughout the lecture is, yeah, more or less unedited transcriptions from On the Road, processed through this means of processing text.
And we've been calling it so far road movie, because the idea was a little bit to make it like we would make a film. So we're gonna first shoot all the material. We're gonna do all of the kind of degradations of text, and then afterwards we're gonna come back and we're gonna do post-production, we're gonna edit it, we're gonna kind of stitch it together. So we're trying to kind of adopt this logic. We're turning the road novel into a sort of road movie. And also part of the process is, for this we've been interested in also finding ways to perform or publish it as we're writing it, also to like bring another loop of feedback in. So we've been kind of slow publishing it over some time now. So often each time we add a new chapter, we'll do a reading of it on any occasion that we have to do a reading. So.
There's also something in the kind of, which I didn't mention before, but the kind of passenger-driver relationship is important. Like this idea that there's two of us and one of us is in charge of the machinery and one of us is kind of looking out at the landscape.
So we thought to also, so when we're writing, we're always writing with other texts. It's very rare that we actually write something from ourselves as Slow Reading Club. There is one exception to that, which is when we're writing an application. And there, we also try to use this space as well to produce writing that we like.
So because our work is anyway so much about communication and noise, it felt strange to kind of like have a parallel version that was properly explained. And so we've tried to often use our applications as kind of occasions to write in different manners. We thought we would read this because it's about road novel. This is for an application for a residency in Lithuania, which we did not get accepted to. So this is the kind of the PDF that failed to produce reality.
Don't worry, it's only 2 paragraphs. So, our interest in the genre of the road novel is less its status as a fading national literature of the USA than a fugitive mode of writing, constantly trying to outpace its own contradictions: form, formlessness, individual, collective, riding, moving, travel, home. Might the genre's insistence on forward motion be a way out of the demands of narrative development? Might the restless subject formation of the road novel provide a usable analog for the subject forming itself in the slew of reading? The idea is not to critique or deconstruct the road novel, but to maneuver it as a gateway into collective writing. The writing process is purely consumptive. It burns through text matter like an engine burns through liquid oil. In longer chapters, the fingers seize up at the keyboard and the eyes lose focus. Bodily exhaustion, too, is constitutive of the writing. What is valuable in these modes of attention and exhaustion is the possibility of a writerly voice that emerges from reception rather than from production. In the traditional road novel, the protagonist is almost always the least interesting character in their own story. They are little more than a stylus to drag across the grooves of a record. Their surroundings and their emotion are what generate the meat of the story. The challenge for such a protagonist, then, is to allow oneself to be dragged.
So I'm aware this is it's going a little long, so we'll kind of wrap it up now. But we wanted to quickly talk about 2 last projects. This is a piece which is called T. It's 15 T's in a row, 16 T's in a row. Basically, at some point we came across a pamphlet that was written in the 1930s, and it was written by Henri Matisse, Eugène Jalas, Maria Jalas, Tristan Tzara, André Salmon, and Georges Braque. So these kind of extremely famous Parisian writers and artists. And it was published in a journal called Transitions, which was a kind of literary journal at the time. And the name of the pamphlet is The Testimony Against Gertrude Stein. And so basically all of these artists and writers, they got together to complain about Gertrude Stein because she had written a book which was a kind of a memoir of her and her partner's life in Paris, and she talked a lot about them and kind of told stories about their lives. And they disagreed with her characterization of them, let's say. It's quite funny to read. It's fairly embarrassing for the authors, I would say. So we decided to reproduce this whole pamphlet with no alterations. So the layout is identical and the text has not been edited in any way. The only difference, or important difference, I would say, is that it's printed on T-shirts. And so we kind of made this set of long sleeve T-shirts and we displayed them like this in the show in Damien. So the idea is they kind of form a book with this spine along the top. But the important thing maybe is that we wanted to kind of use the apparatus of the gallery to also kind of affect the text directly. So basically as the T-shirts get sold and worn, it's almost sort of like pulling pages out of this pamphlet. Like it's a way of breaking up this little block of angry modernists and sort of like dissipating the text into public space or private space. we thought to also, what we also wanted to talk about with this in relation to publishing is we got recently asked to participate in a magazine which we were kind of passing around called Le Chauffage. And they were doing an issue about the photo essay. And so we got asked to think about the photo essay. So kind of like, how can text and photography sit together in a magazine format? And so originally they had asked us with the idea that they would pair us with a photographer, because they said, okay, you guys are text people, we'll pair you with a photographer person and you'll collaborate. And we said, well, no, actually we're also image people, because we're all the time dealing with scans. So scans are images of text as much as they're text. And so we wanted to kind of think about this economy of the scan and this economy of what you can find on shadow libraries. So the project's pretty simple. We re-scanned every t-shirt to bring it back into a booklet format. I should say also the printing for the t-shirts is quite specific. It's not screen printed, it's printed with a plotter printer, which is a kind of like a robotic arm that has a pen. And so we would kind of stretch canvas quite loosely and then print. And when it unstretches, the kind of text warps again. So maybe in another one we can see it more clearly. Like, yeah, here along the margin, you see that the text is kind of distorted by the printing process. And then when you rescan it, of course, you have all of these extra artifacts that come in from the process of scanning. I think something that's interesting about scanning is that, like, the camera moves during a scan, so it's kind of cinema, you know? Like, it's a little bit less like a snapshot, a little bit more like a kind of dolly shot or something. It's a long passage of time. And so what we did is we republished it in this magazine to recirculate it in that format, but we also published it back onto ARG. So we re-uploaded this file back onto ARG with all of the correct bibliographical information for the original text. So the idea is that someone searching for, maybe researching Gertrude Stein, might come across this document and would have access to all of the information that they need, but would maybe not know why it's printed on t-shirts. Like, there's no indication of us as authors in it as a document. When we were thinking about this, there's a writer that we quite like called Sean Dockeray, who actually is also the guy who made ARG, and he writes quite a nice text about scans, where he says that scans are heavy in the sense that they're typically quite big file formats in comparison to like an ebook or I don't know, an export of a document, a PDF. And the reason that they're heavy is they have all of this extra information. Like, you get the text that you need, but you also get this information that you maybe didn't want or didn't think you wanted, which is the paper stock that it's printed on, whether there's any printing irregularities, if someone's underlined things, if the page has coffee spilled on it, like, all of these kinds of extra layers of material meaning are present with the text, alongside the text, and they make it literally heavy. So we were kind of interested in how to kind of keep adding more weight to this one document in each iteration.
So this is the last bit. So also in this movement between these, I mean, we're often moving between analog and digital spaces. So of course confinement comes, and then we're asked to do a slow reading club session online. And we decided it would be actually a kind of nice, I don't know, experiment for us. So we started to lead these kind of slow reading club sessions in an online format, where we worked with the particularities of reading from the screen and reading from PDFs, which felt not so far from what we had already been working on. And we would also work a lot with the interface of Zoom or video conferencing software to produce certain protocols for reading off of a screen. We also did this for very small publics. We were trying to avoid this kind of broadcast model that was happening at the moment. And instead, we were actually doing these reading club sessions for, I think, 4 people maximum, and trying to actually make it a space where we could be talking about the text, talking about the protocols. And with this, we encountered the question of what do we do about the publication. So what we decided to do was to make a zip file dump publication. Many of these exist, and in the process of working on it, we downloaded plenty onto our computers. And so we made a zip file dump, and this is what we've been kind of integrating the materials into today. It's called Yes. We wanted something positive and affirmative. And here's also other images from the file as well.
So basically, like the file, it included, I mean, thinking again with this idea of extra meaning, like it included all of the text material that we were going to read during the session. So everything we needed to be there was there. But there was also a lot of other material, like really quite a lot of material. And it was a mixture of like drafts of videos, other PDFs that we weren't going to read, like holiday photographs. We spent quite a lot of time going through our WhatsApp conversations and like pulling photographs out of it and putting them into this document. Because it was confinement, we were also kind of trying to think about like this private-public threshold, and we were sort of thinking as this publication as a failure to properly differentiate between the public act of performance and the private act of living.
Another maybe aspect about it that was that we liked is that with these zip file dumps, so you download it, and when you unzip it, the contents are downloaded onto your computer and integrate themselves into the computer itself. So then everything within the file becomes a searchable entity on your computer. So the possibility that people could stumble across a random PDF that we had kind of shoved in there was also kind of fascinating to us, like how this thing could have, could iterate itself after the performance or the reading itself.
Yeah, there's a kind of slightly viral logic, like it embeds itself in the computer that it's downloaded onto.
Also, the files are not named what they're named. So, yeah, if you search eyes, I'm not sure what you'll find here. And we also kind of would put the texts into these. There was one protocol we had with 2 readers, and so one had to go into the folder me and one had to go into the folder you, for example.
I think that's all we wanted to kind of bring up within the framework of this talk.
The last road novel.
We have, yeah, do you want it? It's long.
We have a last section of road novel.
It's maybe enough.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, I didn't even mean to. That was good timing.
Maybe here's time for some questions. So who should start with?
Thank you. I have a question about the last point that you were talking about. Actually, it's a 2-part question. First of all, I wonder if you could tell a little bit more about the difference of the digital reading groups versus the real life. I have a question that goes on top of that, because nowadays that you explain the folder, it goes on the computer and we find different things. It almost feels like it's going more analog or manual, because you have to like search through things and open it, like manually look for something, and then the typewriter or checker, which is digital, like so you're going digital and analog at the same time. Maybe could you say something about that as well?
I mean, I could say maybe quickly for the reading sessions how they worked. Like, as Brianna said, we didn't want to do broadcast. Everybody who was trying to make work in that period, it seemed like, was doing broadcast. There was a lot of radio broadcast. There was a lot of live streaming. Always taking this model of one person speaking to lots of people. We weren't super interested in that. We didn't think that was valuable at that moment. So we we would organize these sessions that were much shorter, where we would just read one text with one protocol, and we would, sometimes they had 4 people, but often it was really just us plus 2 participants, because we thought it was nice to have this possibility for sort of stranger intimacy at that moment, that you would then log onto this Zoom call with 3 other people, and there was space for us to talk, and we would kind of like hang out afterwards and speak to the participants.
Just to give like an example of one of the protocols also maybe, because it was quite specific to try to develop them. There was one where we would go into breakout rooms, so it would just be 2 people in each room, and we would read the text back and forth to each other, but when you were listening to the text, you would only have the image of the other person up on the screen, and you would kind of trace the contours of their face while they were reading to you. So you would sort of touch their face, and then, sorry?
With your cursor.
With your cursor, sorry. It's confusing.
I mean, other stuff was like playing with the sort of mute function, like basically all of the protocols were mining certain things that were possible within Zoom. Like we really went deep into the submenus. And I think that was for us a way to say, like, as much as these protocols tried to make reading itself visible, we wanted to make Zoom visible. Like, I don't like Zoom. I don't want that it becomes a naturalized thing, and that we all, like Zoom would like that we all forget that Zoom's there, and we kind of behave as if there's not this thing in between us. For us, it felt important to use it because it was the only way that we could speak together, but to also say, like, it's a really unnatural situation and it shouldn't be allowed to naturalize. And so to kind of like find ways of alienating the interface was a lot of the kind of idea of those sessions. I forgot the second half. It's something about analog digital.
Because this last part it's quite analog, because you are looking through files almost like going into like an archive. So it's like making something digital analog or manual, and then like against the digitalizing of Czech-Arabic in the way you're like typing instead of reading, so it becomes like more digital instead of analog, like how those two play together. Or against it.
I think it's a really good question. I think in a way, like the way we're kind of going through the file now, there is something that feels quite analog, perhaps, in it, or even like concrete poetry, or even like. But once it actually integrates itself into the computer, anything can be drawn up at random. There's actually one kind of interesting thing that Sean Dockeray says, which is with PDFs or with ebooks, you can actually read by almost like with a pin. So you can land on a word, you search a word, you land on there, and then you read around that thing. So in a way, there's also many ways of accessing this file. If you search one thing and you open into this folder, you can also kind of work backwards into the other stuff. So it's actually just another kind of mode of entering, something that perhaps looks chronological, but
I think this kind of idea of making the digital more analog. We work a lot on computers, but we don't program. We don't have any expertise. It's very crude the way that we work with computers. So I think there's something there that's kind of analog. I would say, like, really moving around the files to make these things kind of. We have a friend who's a very good programmer, and every time we explain what he's doing, he's like, guys, like, I could program that in literally 2 minutes, and you've spent 3 days doing it, like.
Yeah.
But it's important to spend the days doing it, like, you learn something.
But during one session, we had to turn the laptop at like 90 degrees.
Yes, we're also, playing with where the laptop was.
11 p.m. having a wine and only 4 people in seats. Was like, who's in the driver's seat or the passenger seat? Became meeting.
They were weird sessions. Yeah, like it was a weird time. Like I remember every Thursday, like we did quite a lot in a row as well, because the theatre that commissioned it, they of course wanted that lots of people could see it, and we really wanted that only 2 people come at a time. So we offered to do it many times in a row. So every Thursday we would just log on for like 3 or 4 hours and have these strange conversations with people in different countries. We were talking a little bit about chat roulette before, like maybe there's a kind of a dream of a sort of pre-sexualized chat roulette that we were trying to live out.
Well played.
I have a question. I was wondering, what do you consider yourselves as, like a performer or a graphic designer or whatever? And if you find that label useful in any way?
Sometimes we kind of like to take the labels on a little bit as a role, almost. Like, I think the first time we did the sessions, they were taking place in a theatre context, and so we were kind of thinking like, oh, great, we're in a theatre, so it's theatre now. So what's the technology of a theatre? Yeah, there's really big lights, we can use tripods, we can use sound, let's like kind of like do the whole thing. I don't know, when we're in an exhibition, you don't have the same sets of technologies, and we didn't want to borrow them and bring them in. We then start to think like, okay, what's the sets of technologies, or what's the role of being an exhibition maker? What's that, and how do we think through that role instead? The graphic design, it's very self-taught with graphic design.
There's a lot of amateurism in the practice. No, but I think it's also the challenge of like, I mean, we constantly return back to how do we think ourselves as readers within each of the contexts, or like how do we think ourselves as readers to produce an exhibition or to, and when it's not about kind of like adopting these kind of makeshift roles, it's also about returning to this question of the position of that, of being a reading group.
Also, another question maybe to elaborate a bit on that. Like in your first PDF, I saw very much down that you had a necrophilic relationship with that author.
Yeah.
Along,
Yeah.
And I was wondering, because I think it makes very much sense indeed to have also this text as one of your, like in that list. And I was thinking about like then with the author as the bird of the reader.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, because with you it's also that reading and writing somehow mix up very much how you are writing now.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering if you can say something about this idea of writing and reading at the same time, but also how you see this liberation of the reader.
I think it's one of my favorite lines in the manifesto still, like a necrophilic relationship to the long stale death of the author. Was also, yeah, I mean, I think being not super interested in what the author is trying to say, like I think we see reading as a possibility, almost like writing to overwrite, but to overread something, that actually in the process of reading you can produce so much distortion that it actually becomes confusing who might be producing the text. And so I feel like with all the protocols, we're kind of trying to manage like what is maybe too much distortion and what is not enough distortion to make this object strange to us or to preserve its strangeness.
I mean, I think about the idea of reading and writing. We had this idea of we kind of tried to attach to this figure of like what we were calling the threshold of reading between reading and writing. So stuff like translation has been important to us because that's really a position. The translator is really a position who's at the same time reading and writing. There's no division. We look a lot at transcription, stuff like fan fiction, kind of trying to, a bit as we said, like locate the act of production within the act of reception, but also to kind of to think reading as like preceding writing, like it kind of comes before. The other part of your question was about the liberation of the reader. In some sense, it's also a constriction of the reader. like we're also interested in sort of like the bondage of the reader almost. No, like they're kind of very often quite uncomfortable or
Constrained.
difficult to manage, constrained modes of reading that we're trying to produce. And so I think the liberation and the constraint, they sort of go together. Like more constraint is more liberation, and sort of maybe vice versa. Yeah, I would definitely say we think first through constraint and maybe second through liberation.
Or more pleasure, maybe.
Yeah.
I was also thinking about the physical part, which is constantly like this line, I think, in everything you share. And the starting point was, I think, more with noise and sound and movement. And so I was thinking, how do you see like the connection between the body as a fluid space, storage of words, of the writing and reading, and actually the embodiment of the words? Like, how do you see the connection from your own bodies related to how you translate it digital and
The embodiment of the works, you mean like the reading protocols?
yeah, like
Or more
actually
than-
the whole practice that you
Yeah.
kind of share
Yeah.
in different ways. Like I also think about the clothing piece, when you put on an extra layer,
Yeah.
at the same time, like the work gets separated. I
Yes.
was wondering how that relates for you to your own bodies
Yes.
and how you storage that, because it's actually also a space.
Space of storage, yeah. It's an interesting question. I mean, we definitely think a lot about storage in terms of computers. I think like that's come across a lot.
Which is also a body.
It's also a body, and it's also an extension of our body, and it's also a kind of a it's also a kind of a shared space in some sense. Like both our laptops include a certain amount of shared material and a certain amount of private material. So that's a kind of an interface already between us as bodies. I mean, one big thing that we've kind of talked about a lot, I guess, is exhaustion. Like we like to work with exhaustion. I think it's a kind of we often work late at night. We often try to push ourselves beyond the point where we're really making clear decisions that we would make maybe 10 o'clock in the morning. So that's an element in which the kind of body of us, our specific bodies, is affecting the production or the making of stuff. But
I think also, yeah, I haven't thought this until you asked the question, but so within the reading sessions, when we're leading these kind of late night ones of 3 hours, it's also a space where people can kind of come and go, and usually we start off with a big number and then we end with like, I don't know, 10 people. So, but then what we insist upon at the end is that we're not actually going to kind of talk about the experience or break down the text, so I think there's also a certain amount of like storage and processing that we expect happens kind of after the reading session, because yeah, we don't feel it necessary within the session to unpack texts or to, and I think we're more interested in this kind of like build up and sedimentation of all of these different protocols, texts, positions of the body. And usually we just propose to like go out and party afterwards. So, which would be like another form of like digesting this.
like, yeah. I mean, I think we were also, especially in the beginning, very careful to always frame these readings as unproductive. Like, maybe they produce something, but we don't want to be responsible for what they produce. Like, we try to frame them as aesthetic experiments. So we would always say, like, slow reading is not better reading. It's not even necessarily good reading. Like, you might not understand anything from the text that you kind of read in this way. At least what often happens is a lot of semantic content gets blocked. What usually survives is stuff like rhythm. You often get a sense of the rhythm of a text, the length of a text, certain elements of the tone of a text, but by kind of suppressing semantic content, which is really dominant in our training, something else kind of bubbles up around the outsides. And I guess, yeah, that's maybe what not discussing helped us to kind of like let ferment also.
For me, it's interesting that there's this element of your practice in writing the novel,
Mm.
And this was an interesting part of being a first reader when you're writing your first reader
Mm.
and editor, and it kind of shifted my perspective on the protocols. I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but that it's, I think it would have been interesting to know more about your writing process with the novel and
Mm.
how you see this in relation to the reading and the protocols that you do as readers versus as writers.
I would say that we are writing as readers. So, like this idea of kind of using the voice and the transcription and the kind of the laptop is for us a way of making text as readers because it has this kind of this other source. It's Kerouac filtered via Brianna and Henry, or it's Persig filtered by us, whatever.
Plus computer.
Plus computer.
I mean, I think we started to kind of work around these protocols of moving from reading into writing, and something about this particular one, and that's kind of like started the ambition of writing a novel, was that it was kind of amazing to enter into this process of writing through reading, and being surprised by the content that comes out. So actually when you're typing, you're in such a state of like trying to catch everything super fast and making these micro decisions that you're not making writerly choices. So you're really in the mode of like typing and reception, and then when you read it back to yourself, you suddenly become, you're again in the position of the reader, and again not the writer. So I feel like it's a process where we're sort of constantly pushing the writer out of the thinking or of the decision making. So it's still, for me, it still feels very much like staying within reading. I think, yeah.
And I think, as Brianna said, so like this novel is still in production. We're writing it. We hope to finish it at some point soon, and like the next step to do is going to be to edit it and then to try and publish it. Like we have the ambition that we'd like to publish it with a literary publisher, not an art publisher, because if it just circulates within the art world, then it's not really a successful experiment, we think. And so to kind of like see if that can move in that world is it's not really an answer to the question, but it's a kind of a like extension of the novel, and again this act of a kind of fictional publishing sort of producing a real situation. Yeah, we'll see if anyone has any good literary publishers.
As you mentioned now that you wanted a literary publisher, but also throughout what Koda said on liberating the reader, it feels like you're attempting to democratize reading again and suppress the semantics. But I wonder, how do you experience it as it still happens in art space? Like, I suppose you want to broaden it more than what it is now in a way.
It's a good question. I mean, it's...
As your book wants to be created in a literary sense,
Yes.
opposed to the art sense, I wonder how you address your readings.
I mean, it's not purely in an art context that we've done these. Like, it's mostly been through like visual art institutions, some theatres. We've done it once or twice in conferences where we've been kind of like a adjunct to a more sort of academic thing. So yeah, it's very much moving within a kind of like educated, cultured reading.
We were once even invited to do a thesis presentation here, to do a slow reading club session around the thesis. So that was also a kind of particular
Art schools, yeah. It somehow circulates also a little bit in art schools.
context.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, in a sense, those are also like the channels in which we are able to move, that we get invited to, that have funding to pay us to make the booklets and to do that. That's also important, of course. And they're a little bit, or you all are a little bit like our readership community that we sort of belong to in some sense. I'm sure there's like shared reading amongst everyone here.
Yeah, I think we talk a lot about like the reading public of like in a slow reading club session. It's this collective experience. We're all there together, but when we enter into like making the book publication, we're dealing with a set of readers that don't necessarily meet each other, that don't know each other, that are kind of dispersed, which would be, I guess, the middle zone would maybe be something like an exhibition or something like that, where there is some sense of eventliness, but there's also dispersion. So I think sometimes we think about like how information is being circulated depending on the reading public, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then like these books or the TTTTT, that then the readers or whoever, no, more the buyers, but would be able to then kind of disperse themselves as well and somehow distribute the text for us. Mm-hmm. So I think also along with reading, we think about circulation and distribution.
A big question is also, like related to that, is also language. So we do these in English usually. That's usually because that's a kind of a shared language. That's usually the shared language. It's both our shared language, it's both of our mother tongues, but it's also often the most shared language in every context that we're presenting stuff. If you do a show in Brussels, more people are going to be able to speak English than French or Dutch or German or whatever, at least in the theatre and the art worlds. But we always try to emphasize, like, in a way, the reading protocols try to sort of, anyway, as an English speaker, you're not getting so much semantic content. So there's maybe like the possibility that you, as a non-native speaker or as someone who's not confident voicing text out loud, you can do it because there's white noise playing, or you can do it because everyone else is wearing earplugs. You know, like there's kinds of ways to yeah. We have a couple of times done it in other languages. We have an ongoing engagement with a Kunsthalle in Dortmund, the Kunsthalle Dortmund, and their public is not at all English speaking. So they asked us to make bilingual readers that could function simultaneously in German, which was a bit of an experiment for us, how to kind of negotiate between different languages. Also because we don't, like I speak German, but Brianna doesn't, and I also don't read a lot of German literature, so it was kind of an interesting problem not to just find German translations of English texts, but to find, to kind of, it was an occasion to dive into German literature a little bit more, which has been nice.
How do you consider the approach of authorship?
Yes.
Because if you talk about translations, also with the scans, that it's actually maybe not even visible anymore what the context was, that it's a t-shirt, it's a work. In which parts of your practice is authorship of yourself important? Because I somehow feel that there isn't really fundamental in the ways you show the world or how you do stuff.
Yes.
The authorship of the authorship, yeah, exactly. The authorship of the original authors is important. Like, even though we sort of read against it sometimes, we always make sure that like the texts are cited and correctly written, and like, you know, whatever. Like we take care of the work that we sort of transport of other authors. But in terms of our own authorship,
I mean, I think we kind of align more or less with like an open source kind of politics. Like we do the protocols at the session, and then people are of course free to use them or implement them in other contexts. And like they're more of a set of tools, and that can be used also beyond Slow Reading Club, I would say.
yeah.
Is also
It's also that we don't author really with our own names. Like, we author as Slow Reading Club when we work together. We don't author as Henry and Brianna. And we both have separate practices still. Like, we didn't stop doing that when we started working together. So it's kind of important to have those separate practices in that kind of shared space. Like, there's a kind of a sense in which, because the Slow Reading Club project or collaboration has been running as long as it has and has kind of had the sort of intensity that it has its own agency that doesn't belong to Brianna or I. Like, sometimes it's really surprising what Slow Reading Club does, and we kind of look at it afterwards. It's so weird. We made a whole session about like mimicry. What was that about?
Yeah. Or being like at base, I think even making a participatory performance is something that neither of us would ever do.
Participatory performance.
So, and in the end, it's like one of the main forms we're using. So, yeah, it becomes actually an occasion to do the things that also you wouldn't do in your own practice. Like, and I think that's where it becomes important as well. I mean, even when working on other things, I can notice when something is more of a Slow Reading Club proposal than my own proposal. And then, so we're often kind of going back and forth between what we're working on and then how Slow Reading Club is changing as well.
At one point we were talking about Slow Reading Club as kind of like our pet. Like, you feed it, you have to feed it and put energy into it and care for it, but it does its own things. It makes its own decisions, and it's nice to somehow find ways to step back and also watch your own production kind of bemusedly, or like let it surprise you also. Yeah, I think that's a big part of the novel writing for sure.
Wait.
Instead of ownership, or I don't think it's about democratizing reading, but I think what you said, the erotics of reading.
Yeah.
How important are the erotics related to the body?
Yes.
Yeah.
And how you guys use the body in the session. So I could ask you in private, but I wanted to ask in public to see what you would say.
I mean, I think the erotics is happening between reader and text, between reader and reader, and between text and text.
How important is it as an agency that you want to explore? Like the otherness that you mentioned?
Yeah.
Erotics is taking care of the otherness?
Taking
Yeah.
care of the strangeness, yeah, protecting the other strangeness.
That's really fundamental.
Yeah, I mean, I think
How much
that,
do you play with erotics?
how much do we,
Lying down, etc.
yeah.
Or is it just something that slips in? I don't think so.
It was a kind of mode of thinking in the beginning, like we said, sort of dominant, submissive, etc. It was a way of sort of acting on text and letting text act on you, rather than trying to kind of decode it or something. We also talk often about like the erotics between texts, like how print meets in a book is kind of hot.
Or, no, but we would think about which texts are touching. And more think about less in terms of a kind of chronology, but like which text did we want to actually physically touch each other in the reader. So even there's this layer of...
But in terms of what I think you're asking about is like the sort of like outward performance of erotics or something, like things that, lying down, holding hands.
The restrictions can also be seen.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I think erotics is more like it's more a mode of thinking than necessarily, like, it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with sex. Like, it's a kind of erotics, I think, or at least the kinds of erotics that we're reading about has to do with kind of holding together contrary positions. Like, we haven't so much thought about like constraints and liberation, but I think that's also there, this idea of like, there's a really like super funny text from Foucault, which it's an interview that he gave like right at the very end of his life, and he got really into BDSM, and he was kind of talking about BDSM in relationship to normative sexual practices, which he keeps calling boys and girls going dancing on a Saturday night, which I think is really, really funny. But he's kind of saying like, okay, when boys and girls go dancing on a Saturday night, sex is kind of this hovering possibility, and there's this game of strategy either side of trying to figure out if it's going to happen. With BDSM, sex is going to happen. It's already decided, and it's already decided in exactly what manner it's going to happen. And so it's about locating pleasure within an extremely fixed formal protocol. And I think for us, like, I don't want to connect it too much to BDSM because it's not a community I know that much about or participate in, but I find that mode of thinking, or we find that mode of thinking of kind of locating pleasure within fixed formal protocols that you know ahead of time what they are, interesting or exciting, or like it offers something to us, yeah, which is bodily and which is discursive and which is sensual.
Erotic.
You always have to have 3 things in a list.
Again, I will try to move everyone to the bar. So we can drink there. And maybe continue
Keep talking.
the discussion.